Community Conversations, presented by the Steve Fund.
Hi, my name is Micah Wilson, and I work for the Steve Fund. Today, the Community Conversation series continues with a focus on what's next for students of color during the upcoming fall semester. We have to ask ourselves, are we experiencing a new normal? Is this a temporary normal, or is this just more that's being added to the other challenges that students of color face every day? Our moderator, Dr. Carlota Ocampo, provost of Trinity, Washington University, and board member for the Steve Fund, will be leading us in this discussion. And she's joined by Nia Dingle, recent graduate of Wilford College, who is also a member of the Youth Advisory Board. She's got a double major in psychology and African American studies and plans on going to graduate school. Dr. Carlton Green is Director of Diversity, Training, and Education in the Office of Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Maryland, and he's also a Steve Fund National Advisor. Last but not least, another National Steve Fund Advisor is Dr. David Rivera, Associate Professor of Counselor Education at Queens College, City University of New York. Thank you, audience, for joining us today, and thank you, panelists, moderators, for bringing your expertise and insights to a very important topic. Dr. Carlota Ocampo, please.
Thank you so much. And of course, I'd like to thank the Steve Fund for hosting this series and this webinar in particular. This is obviously a very, very important topic for us to be addressing. And I'm also very humbled to be on such a fantastic panel with my panelists who truly have a wealth of expertise and also commitment to this work to bring to the table. What we're talking about is obviously the experiences of students of color during the COVID crisis, but also generally, the Steve Fund generally addresses the issues of emotional and mental health and wellness for students of color in higher education, and bringing an equity framework to bear on the emotional wellness of students of color in higher education. What we're experiencing right now, which some are calling a new normal, is a unique pandemic experience that's affecting all of us globally, and we cannot forget that as the various layers of cognitive and emotional impacts occur along with the stratification of our society, that these events may be impacting students, clearly are impacting students of color as well. And so we want to sort of lift that up and really look at what students of color need and require at this time in order to, be able to continue, not just with their studies, but to build on their resilience and emotional and mental wellness. It's a challenge for everybody. It continues to be an extra challenge, I think, for students of color. So we're starting with the topic, is this a new or temporary normal? And we kind of chose that frame because we keep hearing the term, the new normal. This is the new normal. I mean, we're doing this Zoom meet. This is the new normal. A Zoom webinar is the new normal. But is this really a new normal, or is this just an extra layer added on to the already extraordinary circumstances that many of our students of concern are living with? David Rivera, I'll ask you to sort of jump in with how do you define the new normal?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for moderating us in this conversation, Carlota. So when I started hearing this language of new normal circulate, and it started in March, right? We were just placed into this shelter in place, quarantine, whatever you want to call it, situation. And already folks were starting to use this terminology and latch onto, this is our new normal. And in my mind, I kind of took stock of what is this, how am I kind of emotionally reacting to this terminology? And my first reaction was like, well, I don't want this to be a new normal. And it's too early to even know what a new normal is. And psychologically, I'm not even sure if it does us any good to think about anything as a new normal or as a condition that's going to be everlasting, right? And so I was wondering about possibly the psychological impacts of this terminology. You know, as an educator, I'm really influenced by critical pedagogies, and intentionality of language is really crucial. I thought the words that we use carry so much meaning, and it's important that we kind of take stock of the meaning that we're intending to convey via the language that we use. When I also thought about it, above and beyond just the context that the new normal is describing, just the language of new and normality. The term normal is often used to pathologize in other people who do not fit within the social norm, right? Which is most often created by the dominant white cisgendered heteronormative segments of our society. And so just the idea of normality, as a queer person, that term of normality is often reflected in how people conceptualize LGBTQ individuals. And so just that idea of normality and that being thought of as a phrase that can be mapped onto everybody equally and equitably is just not true either. And so just that term normal, I take issue with because the situation that we live in, you know, for many people of color, the issues regarding how COVID-19 is impacting our communities is indeed normal, right? The immense disparities that we're seeing in terms of who are the most infected populations, who has access to adequate and competent healthcare, right? Who's losing their jobs? Who's bearing the economic impact more so? It's communities of color, right? There's already statistics out about that. And so this is not normal. I mean, this is indeed normal, and it's not new, right? For our communities in terms of how we're being impacted by that. And in general, communities of color often bear the brunt of the consequences for any natural or person-made disaster. So what's happening is that these are merely amplified by the context that we're living in. And so again, this leads me to think about this idea of the power of language and how subscribing to a new normal paradigm might possibly exacerbate the emotional reactions related to COVID-19 in our quarantine situations. And that we don't know what's going to happen in the long term. So it might be premature to even use this language at this time.
Yes, I love how you said this is not new and it's not normal, though it is just another layer onto the already sometimes overburdened experiences of the students that we serve and that we seek to elevate. Either of the other panelists, Carlton or Nia, did you want to add anything to this discourse about the new normal?
I mean, I would have to agree with David. Like, I think that this isn't, you know, it's not normal, but it's not new at the same time, because we know that disproportionately people of color are the ones who are these quote unquote essential workers at this time. So we're the ones on the front lines, and we're the ones who are putting ourselves at risk. And in doing that, we're also putting our families at risk. So I mean, this isn't anything new. This has been going on for generations. It's just that people are feeling like this pandemic is highlighting that. But this is something that in our communities, we've already known to be true. So it's just kind of letting everyone else understand it a little bit better and kind of notice it more than they have.
I really appreciate you pointing out that, and I think for all of us and everybody on the panel, raise your hand if the majority of your students who fit, you know, who are students of color, who are first generation, who are maybe high Pell Grant recipients and so on, how many of those students are working while they're in college, right? Everybody's raising their hand. And how many of the students, in fact, are working in what are considered to be essential professions? So that, or essential jobs. So they are on the front lines at the same time that they're trying to finish out their educations here. And that is obviously an added emotional burden as they go kind of out into the front lines every day with their personal protective equipment, such as it may be, right? So I agree. Carlton, I don't know if you had a comment.
Sure, I'll just add a little bit to that. It feels like, all right, we're talking about students of color in institutions of higher education. And what we know is really normal for that experience is to come to campus and to experience or to encounter racism and white supremacy, because the history of our institutions suggests to us that that is actually the way that our institutions have been built. And so we know that when students come back, they're still going to experience racism and white supremacy. So in that way, this is not going to be something new to our students. It's going to be what has traditionally been the norm for our students. We also know that one of the ways that I think about this quite commonly is that students of color, just like other minoritized populations, come to the college campus with the hope and the dream of being able to do well. And we know that students of color can succeed on college campuses. It's actually when they run into the normalcy of racism or the normalcy of white supremacy, that's what makes it difficult for them to be able to succeed, or makes it difficult for us to be able to succeed. So in that way, you know, even as we have COVID-19 sort of like painted over all of this, at the core of our institutions, there's still going to be the racism and the white supremacy that students are going to have to figure out how to navigate.
Yes, I think those are all great points. You know, for me, the idea of you know, COVID-19 being a new normal, for me, it's just on a continuum of experiences that are challenges for people of color and people from underrepresented communities. This is not a new normal. It is in fact an extraordinary circumstance. And as an extraordinary circumstance that we're all dealing with, but even more so in communities that are overburdened with these pressing social issues, we need to have an extraordinary response. So I appreciate everyone's contributions there, and we'll see if those listening have any questions or anything to add about that. In the meantime, let's kind of move on to the idea of one of the things we've seen in the higher education news is that many institutions are starting with their budget cuts because they have lost, you know, revenue as a result of the, you know, the downturn in endorsement of higher ed. Many of these institutions are looking at how can they balance their budgets in a time when, you know, they're reaching out to the federal government for assistance through the CARES Act and so on and so forth. So just everybody is really challenged right now. Everybody is, not just higher ed, but higher ed too. One of the things that we have noted is that typically in times of budget downturn, it's the services that are, you know, sort of tailored for diversity, and I'm putting that in quotes there, that tend to get eliminated first. So what do you think it's going to mean, or what kinds of advice would you have for higher education leaders who might be on this panel regarding, you know, as they consider where to make cuts, regarding the kinds of support services and so on that students are going to need to be able to continue? And Carlton, I'll just go right back to you for your initial take on this.
Sure. I think that, you know, you've laid it out well in thinking about the budget cuts and how budget is going to really determine where we go with diversity services or services that focuses on supporting students of color. We all know, and we've been seeing in the news, that some of the first areas to go on college campuses have to do with like the African American Studies Department or the Women's Studies Department. Those are some of the faculty and some of the academic areas that have begun to see some of these cuts like holistically, like whole departments removed. There's also thinking about how, you know, this will affect a lot of the student support services, whether or not that's in student affairs or whether or not it's in diversity, equity, inclusion work. Those are going to be some of the areas that are going to probably hit hardest as well. The way that I think about this, especially for students who are coming to campus, and maybe even thinking about how administrators are probably thinking about this. I think a lot of people are thinking, how do we capture our first year students? How do we get them in and bring them into the institution and really help them to feel like they are a part, right? One of the things that we really have to be focusing on, especially for students of color, is letting them know or communicating, which we will to all students, but specifically for students of color. This is going to be a first year like no other class that we've ever seen in the history of higher education, especially for those of us who are so like witnessing this. So we're not going to come in with the community access or the access to community building, potentially the way that they have in the past, right? And we know that students of color generally get through an institution of higher education with a cohort effect. Whereas, you know, white students can come in and they can figure out how to access resources, or they have people that they can connect to. Many students of color come in and they form these little trust pods or these cohorts that really help them to get through. So we really have to be focused on how do we facilitate those types of community building experiences for students? We also have to really be thinking in terms of students are not going to see some of the same familiar faces or some of the faces of color that they have seen historically that we've seen on college campuses. Budget cuts are gonna probably mean that some of our frontline people won't be on campus, whether or not those are people who are directly in diversity services or student affairs, which is where a lot of folks of color end up working, or whether or not we're even talking about the frontline people who are custodial or support services people in those areas, which we know anecdotally have been some of the people that generally assist students of color with getting through or persevering in getting their degrees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be losing a lot of those really intangible support services for students that that we know are key to the experience. And then we also know that we're just going to experience a lot of just challenges to diversity-related programming. If we are not institutions where equity is at the heart or the center and really built into the values of the institution, we also know that when people are making decisions about programming, they're going to be thinking about the student, which is generally going to be sort of like that middle-class white student that they're trying to focus on, while always probably leaving out students of color in those conversations because we just don't tend to think about them. And with the high stress, we know that people are going to kind of like regress to the mean or really focus on that middle-class white student, and that's the person that we're going to be programming for. So if we don't make some intentional decisions about how it is that we're going to support students of color, we are actually probably going to see a decrease in retention numbers for students of color. So we really have to be thinking about that as we move forward.
You know, I think that's a really great comment, especially right now as sort of the face of higher education is changing. And as we all know, the high school graduating classes have gotten leaner and leaner as we've moved into the 2020s. You know, more institutions are sort of reaching out more deeply into communities that, you know, historically have been communities of color to, you know, find, you know, the quote top students, you know, to bring into their schools. And the problem is that admission is not just admitting a student, you know, and then you hear, oh, it's so great, we admitted X number of, you know, Pell Grant recipients or whatever it is, which is fantastic. Don't stop doing that. However, the point is that just admitting a student doesn't really mean anything if you don't put the energy behind, and by energy here, I mean economic energy, behind supporting those students to really be successful. And many of these students, not all, but many of these students do need particular kinds of programming and support that are different from what other students need because they come from different kinds of community backgrounds. And I think I agree that, you know, I think I said this at the beginning as well, that in times of economic downturn, a lot of times it's the quote diversity programming that goes first. God knows we've had to, you know, fight hard for this diversity program to begin with, right? And I think that like the idea of the new normal, or is this just an extraordinary circumstance, but kind of more of the same, I feel like in the COVID crisis, we need to keep saying the same things we've already been saying all along. We just need to keep beating the drum harder. David, did you have any comment? And then I'll ask Nia to chime in.
I have a lot of comments about this one, but I'll try to keep them short. Yeah, the budget cuts are also going, I just came from a faculty meeting where we're asked to cut a certain large percentage of our budget. So this is fresh on my mind.
Right.
Who's often going to be targeted first are also the adjuncts. Anybody who does not have a long-term contract or anybody who is, you know, at will or what have you. And we know that amongst the adjunct faculty population, there is a higher percentage than in the tenure track or tenured population of faculty of color, right? And so those, I also fear that those faces, you know, the faces that students are going to come into contact the most if we remain in a distance ed or online format are the professors and faculty. Yeah. And we already know that about 70% of faculty are white of the tenure track, right? And so who's going to reflect that mirror, who's going to provide that mirror image back to the student of where their place is in the profession, where their place is in the academy, if they're not seeing people that look like them teach them. I'll leave my comment there.
Oh my goodness. You know, we could do a whole nother webinar on the challenges of faculty of color getting on the tenure track, staying on the tenure track and getting tenure. That's like a complete webinar in itself. This goes back to what I think Carlton was saying about the formal and informal networks. You know, students of color need to see themselves reflected both formally and informally throughout the institution. So there are formal programs they can go to and be part of, you know, cohorted programming and whatnot. But there are these informal networks that include not only seeing, you know, faculty who look like them, but advisors who look like them and other kinds of employees just around the, I mean, somebody in financial aid who looks like them. Like, you need to see people who are you reflected everywhere in your environment. And, you know, for people for whom that always happens, they don't think about it because it's so natural to them. But for people who don't always see that, it really is so very important. And I think that as people think about budget cuts, they need to think about the intended and unintended consequences of certain kind of cuts. Nia, I saved the best for last. What do you think about this issue?
Well, as a recent grad, I definitely have a lot of feelings when it comes to diversity and retention of students of color, because I mean, you guys pretty much said it. Like, when you have, you know, it's the people in the cafeteria just as much as it's the professor who's, you know, teaching me my instruction, just as much as it's the person in financial aid that I can just go to vent to about, you know, this is what happened, and everyone can relate. Because when you're a person of color at a PWI, like I was, those other people of color understand what you're talking about when you say, oh, this happened to me. Yeah, I understand because that happened to me too. But they're the people who push you, you know, just as much as your family is out there supporting you in your strive for higher education. So are the people, the community you build on your campus that are also supporting you and pushing you. So, I mean, seeing, you know, I've been telling my cousins who are going to college this coming fall that you have to pay attention to what the institution you're thinking about going to is doing during this time. Because a lot of times people don't pay attention because they think, oh, no one's looking. So we can just be making these cuts of, you know, people who are people of color. And, you know, everyone's so worried about this pandemic, no one's really paying attention. But it's the opposite. This is the time to pay attention. Because if your institution is letting go of a lot of people of color, that's going to have adverse effect on your experience. You're not going to see people that look like you that are going to be supporting you. And that's not going to make you probably want to stay at the institution. So I think it's very important to pay attention to where they're making cuts. And I think we discussed it previously, you know, if you say you're about diversity and equity and inclusion at your institution, then that's what you need to stand by, regardless of what's going on. You need to make sure that you can keep those people in place as much as possible, because that's what you as an institution are saying you are going to uphold. But how can you uphold that if you're going to be letting those people go first? It doesn't work like that. So I think, you know, this is the time, like I said, to really pay attention to what institutions are doing and what institutions have said their plan is to do. Just because you say something is your plan to do, if you're not actually making those actions happen because we're in a pandemic, you're deciding to go against what you've previously stated, well, that's more important to me, because my future, my education, I'm the one who's going to be attending. And if I don't feel like I fit in and I don't have people to support me, then I will take my money somewhere else. We know students of color take out loans. They take out everything to go to higher ed. I will take that loan somewhere else because I want to be reflected on the campus wholeheartedly, and I want to feel supported wholeheartedly. So definitely agree with everything that's been said before.
Nia, that you just put that so very well, and I'm sorry, and I'm just going to say, so institutions.
Yeah, I was going to.
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, finish your thought, and then I have a question I'm going to throw in there from the audience, okay?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Micah. I'm just going to say, institutions, don't just talk that talk, walk the walk. Okay, Micah, go ahead.
So there is a question from Aliza from St. Mary's College of Maryland, and she said that she's going to be teaching first year and new transfer students in the fall. The first years in her section also will be involved in their institution's program for underrepresented students. And she wants to know, how can I best support this group of students, understanding that they are new to our school or new to college altogether?
That's a fantastic question, and thank you so much for asking that. So a first generation cohort of historically underrepresented students. As I understand, this is a new professor who's going to be teaching a group of first years. Does anyone have any particular advice? David, I see you nodding.
Yeah, this is kind of one of the areas that I've started my career in, was building support systems for first gen, primarily students of color at highly selective institutions. I always think that we need to think about the counter spaces that our DEI programs create for students, right? You know, a counter space is that space of affirmation in the light of adversity that the students typically have to navigate. And these counter spaces can be created virtually. I just had one on Friday with queer students in the CUNY system. And so I think that we can still take these frameworks that we're used to kind of implementing in person and transition that to online, and even knowing that they might even need it more in the online capacity. I know for first gen students, the idea of building community on campus with similar students who are also first gen can be essential in their success and survival on that campus. Also for students of color, right? We know this. And so as much as we can replicate this online, the better off we're going to be, but we need a lot of intentionality in terms of creating these counter spaces for these students very intentionally, and calling it what it is as well. Like, this is a space for first gen students or for students of color. And I need to foster that sense of community so they can serve as supports for each other, because I can't always be there, right?
Yeah.
And so we're helping to facilitate this community development amongst a group that otherwise will not find community in the dominant culture.
I can add something to that really quickly. And I think it was Aisha, who was a former Maryland intern at the counseling center where I was, who was asking that question. I think that I would say that this is a time right now for us to be thinking about what is the pandemic giving us as faculty and staff the opportunity to learn about diversity, equity, inclusion. How is it that we fine tune our skills for being able to support students who are coming to our campus who may have traditionally been marginalized? There's a really important part of this work that's not always about, well, certainly we need to be talking about how do we support students of color. We have to be asking ourselves, what's the work that I need to do in order to be able to do the work of supporting students of color? A really important part of this work, I think, is about being able to self-reflect, either whether or not it's on sort of like our internalized stuff, or the stuff that we participate in as a part of the white supremacy system, right? If we are not taking advantage of this opportunity to really center that in our own lives, then what we will probably do is just co-opt the white supremacist system that's out there, and we will continue to harm our students. Take advantage of this opportunity to do some of that serious internal work and connect with allies who are going to be able to be able to assist you with doing that work, right? It becomes really important that we're going to build community with students of color. We also have to figure out how we build community among ourselves to have some really honest conversations about some of the skills and attitudes that we need to be developing for ourselves.
Thank you so much. I really love that. And I also want to mention, there's some resources out there around something that's called the hidden curriculum. Many first-gen students of color and, students from underrepresented backgrounds come to college and they don't have what we would, kind of call the same cultural capital that other students might just, understand how to navigate the college environment. And I have been criticized at times because, I think that there are things that we do and perpetrate in higher education just because we've always done it that way without really examining what this is about. And sometimes those things can even seem a little bit like hazing, and they come across as like, well, they need to learn how to be responsible. Listen, my students know how to be responsible. I can guarantee you they have spent plenty of time sitting in lines at government offices trying to get benefits or whatever. They know that experience already. They don't have to sit and wait in your office just for some magic appointment button to go off. Okay, what we need to do is to be able to open that space up and welcome students into that space. We need to let them know that, yes, you belong here, you belong in this room, and you know what? You don't know about maybe accessing a professor's office hours. Let me walk you through that. I've been told, Carlota, why are you hand-holding these students? These are grown-ups, they're adults. Why are you doing all this hand-holding? I'm sorry, I don't see this as hand-holding. When I was thrown into the whole this kind of environment, I had to figure it out for myself, and it was pretty scary. I was lucky I was in an HBCU. Even there, I was very intimidated. There is nothing wrong with reaching out our hands and helping students through some of those. I mean, the point is students are here to be taught and to learn content about a discipline and skills and experiences and to holistically develop. And just throwing up barriers is not helping them. That's a very old-fashioned way of doing things, and we don't need to perpetrate that. Sorry, I got on a soapbox. Nia, do you have a couple words to say about this? And then we'll move on to our next issue here. And we're doing great on time, so I think we're going to get everything in.
Yeah, no, I was just seeing a lot of people in the comments talking about ways to engage with their students of color now that we're on more of an online platform. And I mean, I guess I would say, with what you guys said in terms of engaging, I think, this is the time, like, kind of to rework some things, reinvent, and also just be, think outside the box, like there's GroupMe, there's Facebook, there's other avenues that, because we're typically in a classroom, we don't necessarily pursue, but I think now is the time to pursue those since we're not in front of each other, we're not face to face. But I think also something I've been hearing a lot from my peers is also like knowing when to disconnect as well, because it can be very draining to be on Zoom, for hours on end and have no real relief. And I know some students were saying they felt like they were getting more work because they were online. So it was like their professors were almost assuming that now that you're at home, you have all this time to devote yourself to academics, when I feel like it's actually the complete opposite. For some students coming back home, we don't know what students' environments at home are. So we can't assume that they have all 24 hours in a day to be doing, reading and writing. What we need to do is find that balance. Yes, we can give them assignments and we can say, but you need to be more flexible, because some students also came home and they had to start working. If they live with other people, they're trying to take burdens off of their parents who are also working. So they wanted to have a job, and now they're out here in the front lines as essential worker, maybe working at a grocery store or something like that, and they don't have the time to sit here all day doing assignments. So I think we need to find that balance and find those ways for them to connect as students themselves, to have that outlet to talk to one another, but then also find that balance to like disconnect and say like, okay, this is when we're going to have class, but then like leave it at that. And also knowing that not everyone has access as well to the same things, because I know you talked about some students having to go to like McDonald's and stuff like that because they don't have internet access. Yeah, they don't have internet access at home. So how can they sit here all day doing work if they have to drive somewhere too to also get that internet access? So finding that balance, I think, is very important.
I think that's an incredibly well taken point. And I think maybe Carlton, it was you or somebody said, this pandemic is also an opportunity to learn different ways of doing things that maybe that can become the new normal. I mean, maybe some of the improvements that we make into how we teach and learn at this time could become the new normal. And I definitely think this is an opportunity to learn real pedagogy for online learning. Learning online doesn't have to be the screen all the time. It can be remote learning that's independently completed work. It just needs to be really carefully planned and thought out, and obviously developmentally appropriate to the level of student or the class year of a student, or the where the student is in their trajectory. There's a lot of opportunity here to really improve. And again, switch from, we've always done it this way, to, wow, how can I really attract a new generation of students that may have different kinds of skills that I've been exposed to.
Yes. One thing about that, Carlota, because I do think that this is really important, right? So it really follows up on something that you were saying. And I put a resource in the chat box for people to be thinking about. There was a great webinar that I was listening to, and it was talking about supporting students of color in the virtual space. And you were talking about sort of like taking students by the hand and walking them through the process. One of the points that they made in there is that for students of color, we really have to focus on connecting them to people rather than processes on college campus. Right. We know that students of color come from like really collectivistic backgrounds, so relationships are really important to us. How do we honor that part of students of color experience versus, white students who may have a history of higher education in their family, and so they know about, so like where to go for financial aid or where to go to get this problem solved, like they know about those resources. But for us, we need to be connected to people And so it really does take a little bit of an extra effort to say, let me make sure that I connect this student to an individual person who will then continue to walk with them through this process rather than just guiding them somewhere, right? We have to help them make those connections together.
Right. Well, that really segues nicely into our next topic of discussion. So it's going to sort of shift over. I'm sure we'll have more to say about resources because, there's always a lot to say about that. But one of the things that we talked about is that the sort of what this pandemic is, the exigency of the pandemic to socially distance, for many cultural groups, that has an added mental health effect because our identity is based not just in who we are, but who we are within our community. And so how do we, as we consider, our collectivistic and racial identities, how are we going to be able to continue to support students for whom, the whole idea of social distancing is really having maybe an exponential mental health impact versus, obviously, there are more within group than between group differences. So I'm sure this is something that's affecting everybody. However, we do know that some cultures have this more collectivistic orientation. So really not being able to be together in groups, how is that going to impact students and how can we help to mitigate the emotional and mental wellness effects of that? Nia, did you want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I've recently told my panelists, prior to this that I'm African American, but I also have my grandma's from Panama, so she's Panamanian. So I'm mixed in that sense. And for us, collectivists in both cultures is that's how we operate. We're very family oriented. We like to be in communal living, communal spaces. And it's very similar when you go to college. Like for me, I found my place, in Black Student Union. I found my place in the MED, the Multicultural Office on my campus. And those are places where students of color tend to be because we see like-minded people, whether it's our peers or the people who are, the heads of those offices, they look like us and they can relate to us. So I know for my own experience at my institution, those were the people we started to see being furloughed. So for the students, we felt very, we were disheartened to see that because these were the people day to day who were pushing us and keeping us on our path and telling us we could do what we wanted to do, we could accomplish, we could finish, we're going to graduate. But they were also the same time the ones who are now, being furloughed and they're not on campus in the same capacity. So I think, something I really realized is that, like we were saying earlier, those are the most important people because when it comes to retention, when you build that community, when you go to the MED office, when you go to, your clubs and your activities, and these are the advisors that you're seeing, when you see them being taken off campus, that kind of makes you not want to be there either because you need those people to keep you going. So I think, and it comes to collectivists, this pandemic is definitely changing some of that. And I know, especially for my grandma, she's very much, she's had a real increase in anxiety because of the pandemic, just because she's so used to going out and being around other people. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of our, communities of color, is that we're so used to being with each other. It's hard to distance. Like sometimes you just need that hug. Sometimes you just need that person with you. And to have to actually social distance ourselves for protection reason, even though it's protection, it's kind of disheartening, and it kind of, brings our moods down a little bit because that's how we connect with one another. So I would say, it does play a very huge role, and I think we're seeing that for sure because of this pandemic, that without that, it does create some of a disconnect. So I definitely understand why, I see some of the teachers in the comments saying, well, how can I kind of try to recreate that even though we're distanced? Because if you don't have that, it's really easy for a person of color to get lost, because that's how we connect. Like you said, we connect with people, not places and things of that nature. So we really need those connections to keep us going, to keep us motivated, to keep us wanting to do the work. So I think I don't know how you all feel about it, but I think that, you know, this pandemic is definitely having to create new ways of recreating that sense of collectivism, just because I know, you know, for us, it seems like we thrive off of that. So not having that is definitely detrimental, whether it's mentally or just emotionally, physically, whatever it is.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I also think that one of the things we have to keep in mind is we may be seeing some PTSD when all of this is over, particularly for students who are impacted by sort of that, you know, because what's happening is it's not just like that COVID is, you know, causing them to have to social distance. It's for me, it's somehow getting at their unique experience of who I am in the world.
Right.
Because who I am in the world, part of my identity in the world is about these networks of connection. And that not having that, I think, is going to produce some post-trauma that we're going to have to also pay attention to, even more so for maybe students of color than for other students. Carlton or David, did you want to jump in on this particular topic?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about this from the perspective of racial identity development, right? We know that for students of color, as well as other minoritized populations, coming to the college campus becomes a time of great identity exploration for students. We know as well that, you know, students of color come with the hopes and dreams of higher education. And many of us get there and we quickly figure out that in addition to sort of like pursuing our degree, we also have to figure out how to navigate racism and white supremacy in the institution. And so that begins to trigger identity development or racial identity development in particular for many students. And so what we know is that if we're bringing people to campus and they are now being physically distant, or we are not investing in the resources to help them with that, where they have these experiences around fostering their racial identity, we could also not only see PTSD from so like knowing that some aspects of their identity are being attacked, we could also see some arrested development around racial identity progress, right? And what we know is from the history of our country, right, when we get our students of color to begin to move through those phases of racial identity development to the point that they are experiencing the resistance attitudes and the anger that they need to have, we know that that anger and that resistance actually propels the growth of the institution forward, right? And so if we're not really capitalizing on the experiences of helping our students of color in particular, and I want to leave out other students too, to develop in ways that are really healthy for them and for the institution, we're not getting the best experiences that we could be having for students, right? And so there's got to be some real focused effort on making sure that we are facilitating racial identity development for our students. Otherwise, not only will they experience PTSD, but they will also experience tremendous loss and grief around who it is that they could become.
I just want to mention, I see a comment from Sherry Moloch about this would also affect international students who come to our campuses, and particularly international students of color. David, I wanted to give you a chance to have a thought.
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback off of what Carlton just shared in terms of the arrested development that we're most likely going to see in terms of racial identity development and identity development in general is probably going to come true. And we know we're interpersonal beings by nature. There's a reason that all of us are kind of freaking out having to be with ourselves much longer than we're used to. We're used to being around other people. We rely on being around other people as a part of developing our worldview and how we understand others. And in racial identity development theory, as Carlton was explaining, it's the contact with other people or similar people is important. It often happens in the higher ed campus context. Even for white students, that's often the first time that they have any kind of relationship, let it be alone meaningful relationship with a student of color. So I often fear that the white student racial identity development that's going to impact them or put them in this state of arrested development is also going to then impact the students of color once they get out into the real world and they don't know how to deal with, they don't know how to interact properly. They don't know what a microaggression is. They don't know the impact of that microaggression on the person they're coming into contact with. So I see a lot of opportunity for a lot of disarray, a lot of backtracking, if you will, in terms of the racial equity that the progress that we've created, and that actually had some good momentum, some decent momentum at least, that being rolled back. And so that in-person interaction that we don't we no longer have the luxury of having is going to have to be replicated if we are going to protect not only the students of color, but the population in general, in terms of having a more realistic racial identity.
Mm-hmm. I would just add to that really quickly that I think that this is one of the reasons why I'm always trying to talk to people about the need for faculty and staff to also be engaged in this self-work, right? If we are not developing anti-racist attitudes in order to be able to bring that to our workspaces and to our work relationships and to these policy meetings, or to the meetings with the campus police, or to the people who are planning the campus programs, right? If we're not bringing some informed anti-racist attitudes to those conversations, then we are in fact contributing to just racism, right? Which is going to be the piece that's going to continue to disrupt these experiences for our students, especially in this COVID-19 time. So we really need faculty and staff to be doing the work as well.
I think that's an excellent point. And again, sort of takes us right into our next question, which is, what kinds of things can we do in the fall to create a more welcoming environment for students returning to campus? And Carlton, you mentioned anti-racism training. I mean, I'm a big proponent of campus-wide anti-racism training. And one suggestion, one of the things that we do at my institution, for the past few years, we've had what we call the Trinity read, which is a big read. We select a text, and then everyone on campus reads the text. That includes faculty, staff, and students, and alumni. And we integrate that read into the entire first year curriculum, into some of the other courses. Actually, our first read was Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, which was an excellent big read. And we did a lot of interesting activities. One that was really successful was we had the students come in and each write a letter to their own children. And because that book is he's writing a letter to his son about what it means to be a Black man in America, and sort of some strategies for dealing with the particularity of that experience. And what the students produced was just so meaningful and beautiful, and it gave them a chance to apply a bunch of academic skills, but also to create a really meaningful document. This year, I'm really considering looking at doing Ibram Kemdi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is a very interesting text about his own internal journey of, sort of what you said, Carlton, addressing the neo-colonial, white supremacist thinking, within his own environmental structures, and sort of addressing that. So I think that, at first we had thought about doing a big read, sort of, well, should we do something related to a pandemic, and then we were like, oh my God, people are so sick of this pandemic, we just don't want more pandemic, what we want here is to move the work forward in a meaningful way. And this goes back to what you were saying earlier about, these are the same things we've already been saying. We just need to keep beating the drum. These are the same principles. Students need mentors. We need to promote faculty of color. We need to fund diversity efforts, but not just diversity. It's a great step to have a diversity office. That's wonderful. But actually that work should be integrated into every office. Right. That's kind of our next step. That's where we need to take this work to the next level. So what do you think as you think about welcoming students to campus in the fall, whether that's in some limited physical way or whether it's really, going to be online or however it looks? What are some ways that you think we can welcome our students of color back and really provide the supports and the meaningful kind of sense of connection that they need to know that, yes, you belong here. And this is your space. It is not a space where we're sort of nicely inviting you. This is your space. You own it. You belong here. This is your room. Your wisdom, insight, presence, what you bring is important. How do we do that?
Well, I saw something in the comments regarding, mental health at this time, especially with they're talking more so with, Black men and faculty and students of color. But I think that's definitely one thing that does need to be taken into account in terms of returning to campus, whether it's virtual or in person in some capacity, is working on those mental health resources, and not just mental health for, cis communities, but also for people of color. And I know that at a lot of institutions, there's not a lot of people of color in the mental health offices. So maybe working on, kind of buffing that up a little bit, just because, we're still going through this pandemic. We don't really know what's going to happen. So you definitely need to put those supports in place for mental health, because if your mental health isn't strong, you're not going to do well academically. You're not going to be able to you can't pour from an empty cup. So I think that's definitely one thing that does need to be addressed in terms of whatever type of return we're making at our institutions, even if it's some type of virtual, having some type of resource virtually that students can, speak to someone, or having it in person in some capacity. I think that's definitely one thing that needs to be addressed. It's going to need to be addressed for a while, I believe.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Molak, Sherry Molak again, has also mentioned that it's good to provide this mental health support for faculty and staff and really everyone in the institution, because if you're not on your own, path of mental health and wellness, it's hard to, really create that for others. So I think that's an excellent point as well. Other panelists?
Yeah, I have a thought. I don't know if it's hard to say the same I'm going to say to this welcoming environment, because I think we have to resist taking a colorblind approach to addressing how COVID-19 has impacted our communities. And I fear that's what's going to happen. We're all in this together. We're all experiencing this. Yeah, we're experiencing a similar context, but we're experiencing very disparate consequences, right? And that needs to be overtly stated. Students want to be seen. Students of color want to be seen and validated for who they are. And if we take a colorblind approach to how COVID-19 has impacted our communities, we're not going to see them. They're not going to feel welcomed. They're not going to feel understood, right? And so I know that's going to be part of the messaging that universities and colleges are going to incorporate into their days of welcome, whatever that's going to look like. But I think that we need to make sure that people are seen for their true realities of how they are experiencing this extreme a time in our lives right now. So I would just say no colorblind attitudes when it comes to anything, especially this. I often also think like in orientations and what have you, that those are often generalized, right? And I think that we need to resist generalized orientations. An orientation for a first generation student has a whole different type of meaning than it does for a legacy student, for example.
Yeah, one of our attendees just wrote, "Same storm but different boats," and I think that's really well put. And if we can just move to the next slide, we were going to talk about what's next. And I think to your point, David, what has been so salient for me about the COVID crisis is how it has highlighted the inequities that are built into our society generally. And I know that those of us who are in the trenches and doing this work, it's like we know this all the time, and we just can't imagine that other people wouldn't know this. But all of a sudden, the national press is discovering that there are inequities in America, and that it's our health system that is really highlighting, the inequities. And so I think this is this time, in terms of what's next, how do we prepare for what's next? This pandemic moment is really an opportunity, because everyone has lived through something extraordinary. Everyone has lived through something that hopefully has caused them to stop and reflect a little bit on the meaning of life, more than what they would do during the normal course of existence, so to speak. And one of the things that we can reflect on is like, wow, we really still have deep embedded inequities in our society that we really need to address with much more intentionality than what we've been doing so far. It's time to stop paying lip service to these issues and really do the serious work that's necessary to address some of these inequities. So what's next for me? More activism. How about you all? What do you think is next?
I'm just going to probably just revisit the same drum that I've been beating and offer a resource for people, which is this is an opportunity for us to really be thinking about how do we handle race and racism in the context of higher education. I like the suggestion for reading. I also think that Layla Saad's work entitled Me and White Supremacy is an excellent resource for people to be thinking about. It's a it's a journaling. Layla Saad is a woman of color who created an Instagram series in the aftermath of everything that was happening in Charlottesville a couple of years ago. And it became, she created this online resource for people, and now it's a New York Times bestseller.
Wow.
It's a 28-day journey for people to really be asking themselves the question, specifically white folks, to be asking the question about what is my relationship to white supremacy? What is it that I'm doing in certain spaces to either uphold or to dismantle white supremacy? And I think in this time where COVID-19 is really exposing how deeply embedded racism is into the American society, we have to really be thinking about, what do I do? How do I take up my own individual stance on this so that I can move forward? The book is called Me and White Supremacy. And it's by Layla Saad, L-A-Y-L-A-S-A-A-D. Layla Saad, Me and White Supremacy.
Perfect. Thank you. I see that a number of people are asking. That's great. I was unaware of that. I'm definitely going to pick that up and take a look. I would like to, we have about 4 minutes left before 3, and I know some people may have a time constraint. I think we can go about 10 minutes over. I would like to ask if there are any questions from the, have a question. Type it out in the chat window. Anybody else have a question?
Oh, we have a few questions. I've got 3 questions. We will go over a little, so thank you, audience, for your patience. The first question is just it's from Dr. Maria Delgado Guerrero. Apologies for mispronouncing anyone's name in advance. From Marquette University. This is an extension of the earlier question, more specific to helping Daca students. And, you know, because now the Supreme Court's about to make a decision very soon. They have an added layer of anxiety. So they're asking how to help them and address their concerns with what's happening in their lives specific to DACA. And undocumented.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. DACA are students who have a temporary kind of documentation. These are students, I mean, probably everyone knows, but they're kids that were brought here by their parents prior to the age of consent. So they didn't, you know, immigrate illegally, but they don't have official, you know, papers or visas to be here. And then at a certain point, they were afforded a kind of temporary status called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA. But the current administration, the current federal government has thrown that program into question, and that's what the Supreme Court is about to decide. So yes, these students have particular challenges. Anybody on the panel, any special advice regarding protecting the students with, or even, you know, we may have undocumented students on our campuses that we don't know because they don't identify.
Right. I wish I had a brilliant, elegant answer for this. And Marla, nice to see you here. And great question, because there were some of the most vulnerable students, right, in our populations, right? I was on a call earlier, and someone was talking about how the need to support DACA students and their emotional well-being is one of the salient aspects of it, is that sometimes their families don't want to talk about these issues at home because of how emotionally charged they are. And they really want their students to do well in school, right? They want them to get their education and not be burdened by a lot of the issues a lot of the anxieties that are produced with DACA going away possibly, or the education going away because of the status and what have you. I do know that institutions do have some power to create systems, do have the power to create financial pots of money to support. And so I really think it's an institutional issue that that's really going to help support and ensure that the DACA students that are currently enrolled in our institutions of higher education remain there throughout graduation. I think providing spaces, again, I can't go back to counter spaces too much, but providing them specific spaces. I know in the CUNY system, we've had leadership programs specifically for DACA students, where we've brought them together, and that has been an essential source of support for them to just come together and share their common experiences and also brainstorm together solutions. They're the ones that they have brilliant solutions themselves, right? We shouldn't assume that we know what they need either, right? We need to go to their mouth. I'm Latino, but I'm not DACA. I was born here. I have a birth certificate from the United States. And so my experience is much different. So I need to go to them for what do you need? What do you think is going to work as a resource or as a solution to help you get through this stage of your life?
I agree. I think a couple of the points that you made that we can really pull out. One is specific resources for these students. And this has to be independently raised by the institution because the federal government does not provide it, as you probably are aware. And the other is the idea of, again, creating spaces. And these spaces can be related to activism. Here at my institution, we have an organization called the Butterfly Network, which, of course, you don't have to join, but certainly if you are an undocumented person or a person with Daca and you want to be a part of it. And so we do a lot of actual direct community action, lobbying, activism. We're in DC, so we can go right to the heart of the matter. And that is empowering for students, I think, because it makes them feel like they do have a voice and they can participate in the civic process even if they can't vote. So,
Okay.
Another question.
Question number 2, and then we'll have one final question after this.
Perfect.
This is from Robinson Perez. I'm really concerned about the increase of suicide rates, particularly for Black men, both students and faculty experiencing more of this. How do we push mental health resources during this time?
Yeah, I was actually just putting something in the chat box about that.
I saw that.
I was, really posing the question about what has right now taught us about providing mental health services. As a therapist with a small private practice, I've transitioned all of my clients to online. And everybody has been great. People have really appreciated that. And I also know that on college campuses, therapists are doing the same thing. We have to begin to ask ourselves, can this be one of the new ways that students of color would access services that make it less stigmatized, provided they have access to technology, of course, right? Because for some students, walking into the counseling center is actually what makes it really difficult to go to the services. But if we can begin to think, can we allow these services to come into their residence hall room or wherever it is that they find themselves, right? As a way of reducing some of that stigma, that could be really important. The other thing that I was putting out there is that recognizing that many counseling centers are now doing their outreach virtually. So they're able to produce these webinars or these talks and they record them. Why not now just think about recording some of these conversations with students of color in mind? How do we begin to talk about racial trauma? How do we begin to talk about suicide, right? With people of color involved in these conversations such that we're really putting out the information from people of color, right? Which we know that students of color may be more likely to trust. How do we create some of those online services for students such that they can have access to it when they need it rather than having to come in and find us in order to be able to get some of the answers, some of the information.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So our final question is from Robert Gonzalez. As a first-generation student of color and soon-to-be junior advisor for incoming freshmen at an elite, predominantly white institution, they want to know, how can I best support incoming first-gen students of color while also taking care of myself?
Oh boy, that's a question we're all asking ourselves all the time. So very good.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, be genuine and also don't overextend yourself. We're all going through this pandemic, but like someone said, different circumstances for everyone, even though similar situation in terms of globally we're all going through the pandemic. So I think just, it's fine to want to help people and want to be their support, but I think also knowing when to say no and also knowing who else you can point them in the direction to when you can't say yes is very important, because we still have to take care of ourselves. We're also students ourselves at the end of the day. So we have, things we need to get done, and we can't overextend ourselves either, because then we'll be doing a disservice to ourselves and then a disservice to the community. So I think, knowing when to say yes and no, and then knowing who else you can kind of point those students to is also important. because you'll build that relationship with them and they'll know that you're always someone they can come and talk to, but you'll also build that trust that they know, oh, this person knows other people and I can find, other people that can help me with whatever it is as well.
So I'll add one thing is that, a couple of weeks ago, we did a webinar specifically for mental health professionals who were supporting communities of color, how to really think about self and community care. So I would direct people to that webinar, which is a great place to be thinking about how do you begin to think in terms of supporting myself, but also really still being integrally involved in the communities that also give me support, right? Rather than thinking of self-care as this individualistic notion that's about getting your nails done or getting a massage or, those things are nice, but we as people of color tend to think in terms of we as a community. So it becomes really important to think about how do I care for myself in the context of my community as well.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just follow up with that. Given that Carleton's part of my support network, make sure that your support networks are up and functioning and in full force because you're going to need them. You probably need them a lot right now. That's similar to what we're going to do. What I would recommend doing for your students, as I mentioned, is helping to foster that sense of community amongst your students. But we need to have that for ourselves. I know without mine, I wouldn't be sitting here right now.
Absolutely, 100%. And I would say that sometimes the best way to help others is to accept the help that one needs oneself. And we sometimes feel like we are all in this alone, like each one of us is in this alone. We are not. We are all in this together, and our own experiences are shared by so many others. And we don't talk about it because we feel that sense of guilt and shame and trauma. And once we start talking about it, we realize, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one who goes through this, who experiences this. So really reaching out. I mean, sometimes when we accept help, we model that for others. And that is really the best way to even self-care for others, is by modeling it, by accepting it ourselves. I will just say, in my own experience, this has been an amazing, awesome conversation. I feel like we could go on for the rest of the day. I kind of want to go on for the rest of the day. I want to super thank my amazing panelists. You all can see just the amount of sort of expertise and commitment and vibrancy that we have. There are people like this all over the United States of America and really globally who really have the best interests of students of color at heart and want to make the world better by making their world better. I want to thank the Steve Fund for convening these conversations and for all of the amazing work that the Steve Fund does. This is such an important conversation, and the fact that the Steve Fund is the premier organization that has elevated the importance of attending to the mental health and well-being of people of color is just a really exceptional service. So I urge everyone to continue to look at the Steve Fund resources, reread the transcript of this call. There have been some excellent resources. Hector Adames posted a link for a toolkit to help students who are DACA or undocumented. So I just think that there's a lot here, and I want to thank the Steve Fund for having me and for enabling me to facilitate this conversation. And thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you around.